Hi, this is Don McAvinchey. I'm a longtime therapist. I started doing counseling work in 1974, believe it or not, way back in the dark ages. Um, and I'm here with my dear friend and my spiritual director, Jonathan Ellis. And we are doing an interview. Jonathan, you might want to just say hi real quick.
Hello.
Um, Jonathan offered to interview me as I was struggling with writing a book. And so this interview is, in some ways, an alternative beginning to the book, or perhaps even an alternative resource. And the title of this series is The Therapist's Way, a journey into the art of being a therapist. And I've been at this therapist work for over 45 years now, and I've been very, very dedicated to finding and evolving my own path as an artist, as a therapist, as well as training and coaching and supervising dozens and dozens of graduate students and interns and people in the field to be their best possible sense for themselves of what they can be as a therapist, to find their own way into this great art, this wonderful art that we have as a therapist. So Jonathan is going to interview me here today about that, and we'll see how this all goes. We hope that it lands for you and is relevant for you. So, Jonathan, there we are.
Yes. First question that comes to my mind on is what does it mean for you to view therapy as a spiritual path? Lots of people talk about having a spiritual path. And what does viewing therapy or being a therapist mean for you as a spiritual path?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think of a spiritual path in many different aspects, but let me just address a couple of those. Um, One is that there's a calling that we receive. Um, I don't think too many people enter into being a therapist thinking that they're going to be super wealthy in this kind of role in the world. I personally came through the clinical social work direction through grad school. And I think there's something besides money that pulls people into being a therapist. And that calling, as the beginning of a spiritual quest, a spiritual path, has to do, I think, with our most cherished and meaningful vision that we have for the life that we want to live. So that aspect of therapy being a spiritual path, the practice of therapy being a spiritual path, has to do with the inner calling to be of service, to contribute, to make the world a better place, to find ways where our own insights and intuitions about ourselves and about our clients can be put to good use for the betterment of those people who come seeking our help, and also for the betterment of the world itself. The second aspect of a spiritual path is that I often think about spiritual paths as being challenging, that they're not the easy path to take. They're not the quote normal path to take in life. There's something about our own essence that is reaching out and pulling us into a vision of who we can be as a person. And in that way, being a therapist, pursuing the art of therapy, tests us. It really challenges us to find a wonderful balance, as Carl Whitaker said, between compassion and courage. and to reach within our own selves to test our mettle, to find how strong we can be and how compassionate and empathic we can be at the very same exact moment. I think those two aspects, just as the ground for a spiritual path, evolves us as a person and as a therapist if we stay dedicated to it. There are lots of other aspects of spiritual path we could talk about, but those are the two that stand out for me.
Yes, and let me say at this point, I have taken the spiritual name Ananda,
Hmm.
Ananda. Feel free to refer to me as Ananda in the rest of this.
I will. I will. Thank you for
Very good.
that reminder.
Um, I know, Don, you in our conversations use the word numinous to describe an aspect of the way that you approach therapy. I was wondering what you could say about that word numinous and um, what does it mean to welcome the numinous into the room when you're doing therapy?
Yeah.
What does that even look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Um, when I was first introduced to this idea of the numinous, it came through the narrative therapy community. And there was a sense that being in the therapeutic context was more than technique, more than strategy, more than evidence or data-driven ideas, that there was something very powerful and very profound as human beings to enter into that partnership with another person or with a family that speaks to and calls something deeper within us to come to the surface, something more expansive. And originally, when I heard the idea of the numinous, it was about place, like the spirit of place is one of the definitions of the word numinous. What has transpired for me is that the um, the experience of therapy has often taken on a uh, an atmosphere, uh, an energetic, maybe even an energetic context where something different is happening. Something, I would say, something almost magical is happening, where a person is moving from an old way of actually being as a person through a journey into a new way of being. And that sense of the energetic thickening and becoming palatable, and you can almost sense being able to reach out and touch it, this energy in the room when the numinous shows up. It became a constant experience for me in my therapy work, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And we noticed it a lot in the supervised family therapy sessions that I used to help out graduate student interns with. That that energetic would show up, and people in the family, for instance, the clients would rise to a different level in terms of their capacity to love, in terms of their willingness to see a different future, in terms of even owning their own struggles in a different kind of way that was more integral to how they could be as a person. So it became so prevalent for me that this would happen in my sessions that I started finding a way to kind of slide into a mindful place in the middle of the sessions and hone in on this sense of the numinous, this sense of the thickened, energetic atmosphere and then to speak from that place because I could feel it within my own intuition, my own sense of self, that something profound was happening. And to feel into that and to ask questions from that space, from that state of mind that were very oftentimes, most of the time, very surprising questions for my clients to hear and opened up real space for change in a way that I don't think I would have predicted, sitting down with them in the beginning of that kind of work. So calling in the numinous to me is just that. It's going into that mindful place, going into that place of a richer, thicker chocolate malt kind of energy in the room. um, and it's way beyond techniques, way beyond data-driven ideas. There's something much, much more profound than that.
Yes, Don, I resonate so much with what you say, but I'm just going to stick with the questions for you rather than give you my response. But
Okay.
so I hope others have been able to follow what I've been trying to, what you've said so far. You mentioned evidence-based practice, um, uh, and the expert role that the therapist can sometimes be put in or place themselves in, um, runs a risk of uh, making less possible that kind of numinous experience.
Mm.
What is the problem with evidence-based practice, and how does that fit into the art of therapy that you were describing?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Ananda, for that question. That's a that could be a whole series, just just this part. But let's take a stab at it. First of all, it's become very popular in our field to declare approaches to therapy as valid if and only if they are evidence-based or data-driven. And what's what's problematic to me about that, what's really challenging to me about that, exists in a couple different levels. One level is who is it that gets to decide what evidence even is? And why does it get decided the way that it does? Just in asking those questions, you immediately throw yourself into being a heretic to the whole system. um, but it astounds me sometimes that people talk about it in a way that looks like it bears such authority when these ideas of evidence, the ideas of even to things like diagnoses or performing an assessment on a person, those seemingly grounded truths in our profession are simply concepts. They're not they're not real. They're not real like this is my nose or this is my ear. They're not they're not real like that. They're ways of thinking about the way that people operate and the way that people get along or don't get along with other people in their lives. The big problem to me with that is that there has been created this massive power structured system called our mental health system. And in that system, there's a hierarchical structure that therapists have to align themselves with in order to get jobs, in order to get a paycheck, in order to have your licensing renewed. And all of those pieces of that structure have become, in my humble opinion, they've become structures for control. There were even people at the last DSM uh, conference or whatever they call it when they decide what's going to be in the DSM,
And what the DSM is for those who don't know,
the
most people would.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the big book that has all the different diagnoses and its codes and what those diagnoses contain. It's certainly one way to think about what we do as human beings and when problems come up for us, but it's not the only way to think about them. At the last conference, when the next version of the manual was decided, there were people from the drug industry represented there, and that was the first time that ever had happened, to my knowledge. Now, does that make sense that people who prescribe or create drugs for people who are struggling with mental, emotional issues would be at the table for making decisions about diagnosis? I suppose that could make sense on one hand. But the problem is then the structures get laid in all the way across our profession. And those structures become systems of control. And not just systems of control for clients, but systems of control for ourselves as therapists as well. We have to align ourselves with all of those systems in order to be considered to be not just a effective professional, but to be a good moral person. And that's problematic to me at a very fundamental level. I think the idea of evidence, finding evidence for struggles that people are having, are there patterns? Are there groupings of characteristics, which is what DSM in many ways is? Can we see those patterns? We're pretty good as human beings at detecting patterns and making use of them in the ways that we figure out life. Could that be helpful? Yes, it could be helpful. But to have that be the sole basis of what a therapist does with techniques and strategies based in those kind of evidence-based systems, I think we're missing a really, really valuable part and a fundamental part of what we do as therapists. And that is in engaging who we are as a person, everything from our brain, which may be pattern recognition, really good at that, evidence-based, really good at that, but also our hearts, our guts, and even into our bones in terms of metaphorical ways of thinking about this. All of those aspects can be part of the art of being a therapist. We find a way to balance them out. If we're solely focusing simply on evidence, I think we're running a major risk of not just being less of service to our clients, but also as therapists, and I talk to and have talked to hundreds of therapists over the years around these issues, that we as therapists experience a distance from our clients in terms of humanity, in terms of our own sense of connection as human beings. And that leads, I think, directly to therapist burnout. And
Yes.
and that's a big problem in our field, the burnout of therapists. So that's Ananda,
Don,
that's a nutshell of it. We could go on for quite some time, but there.
yes, yeah. Folks listening to this conversation may well be therapists, so they'll know things like what the DSM manual is. Perhaps later in our conversation, we can talk about how folks can cope with what you described so elaborately just there.
Mm,
Uh, but before we get into that, I thought we might spend a bit more time on what does it mean to practice therapy as an artful science.
mm,
So we know what it is that people are aiming for. Then we can talk perhaps later on about how one can move toward that given the constraints of the circumstances they're working with.
yeah, yeah.
So you just mentioned that wonderful phrase, therapy needs heart, guts, and bones, or therapists need to use heart, guts, and bones as well as brains.
Mm,
Say a bit more about what that means for you.
yeah. With a big nod to the author of The Artist's Way, a wonderful book that came out some years ago, and the author has gone on to produce years and years of workshops and students coming through. The Therapist Way, as I've uh, come to think of it, is a way to bring together those different aspects, and I'm calling them the brains, the heart, the guts, and the bones. In the way that I think artists bring those different aspects together in their artistic work. So to be a full human being in our therapist practice is one way to consider what the art of therapy is. And it doesn't mean that therapy becomes like our therapy. We don't turn it into our therapy. What it does mean, though, is that we can come into um, the engagement in the relationships that we have with our clients as a human being. We have a very, very different responsibility in that room than what our clients have. And it's really important to stay in the integrity of that responsibility. And we're still human beings. We don't leave that behind somehow when we step through the door. So engaging first of all our hearts, which means caring about that person. There was a really wonderful study done a few years back. I think this is a good way to think about evidence that shows up in research. And the study was a question of to the clients, when was it in the process of therapy when they started to feel that change was not only possible, but had begun for them? And overwhelmingly, the clients in that study said change started to happen for them when they knew that their therapist cared about them as a person. Prior to that, it was maybe techniquey or a little bit wooden or um, maybe structured in ways. But once that caring factor kicked in as a human being, then that client experienced that sense of the possibility for what this therapy could mean to them. That's the heart connection. And we could go into that at length, of course, for days. But the guts connection is that within our own sense of what is real, within our own sense of how we can speak the truth that we feel, are there ways to, as Carl Whitaker said, to not only feel the compassion of the heart, but to feel the courage of the gut, that we can ask difficult questions in challenging moments. To balance that courage, to be able to do that gut courage, to really trust our intuition. So many times, literally thousands of times, it's happened in therapy for me where an idea will come up in the midst of a session. I'll set the idea aside because it feels a little bit too challenging, or the timing isn't quite right, or I'm a little bit afraid of saying it out loud. And then the idea will come up a second time in the conversation, and I'll set it aside again. But if it comes up a third time, then I know that my gut is actually calling to me to say something about this. And so what I do in those moments is I tell people this is what's been happening over the last 20 or 30 minutes for me. This idea has come up now 3 times. And would it be okay if I asked a question based on that idea that keeps coming up for me? So to give them the power of whether to hear it or not, to let them say, yes, I'd like to hear what your question is. And I also preface it by saying, I don't know if it's accurate. I don't know if it relates for you or if it's relevant for you. And you can absolutely feel free to tell me if it's not. And many people have. They've told me, no, that doesn't fit. Most of the time, that gut intuition lands pretty close. and it opens up a space again for change to happen. So that's the guts part. And then the bones. So the bones for me are the idea that life itself, like this energetic of life that powers how we go through our 70, 80, 100 years of life, that grows trees and creates fish and that's this thing of called life that that's in the very bones of who we are as people, just like it's in all the rest of life on this planet. And the energetic of life itself can be relied on to help people move forward, to reach into their own bones, to say, wait a minute, you just said something really fascinating to me and you kind of skipped right on by it. And I'd like to go back to it for just a second because it kind of startled me. I felt my body sort of react. And it felt like there was something really profound in that. Can you speak to that, like from the inner part of who you are as a person? That's going into the bones, like really moving into that deeper, richer kind of sense of who they are. Combining all of those with the brains, which is the evidence-based part, and considering that those four aspects can be the four pillars of an artful science, including our own willingness and ability to own our own humanity in that room. To me, that's the journey of the art of therapy.
You mentioned the possibility that in the course of therapy, the therapist, the counselee, is experiencing pain. How does the therapist approach that pain without trying to fix it?
Hmm.
Or how does the therapist stay soft without collapsing,
Hmm.
holding the space for the person uh, without trying to undo it?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Ananda. That's a great question. Yeah, there's a foundational thought to have here first. And that foundational thought is that the pain we experience as human beings, the struggles, the suffering, the grief, the sense of being lost or uh, discouraged, that those kind of pains don't make us a problem. They don't necessarily define us as human beings, that we have the capacity to experience that kind of pain because we're alive. And the beauty of that, even though it's incredibly difficult, sometimes like so overwhelmingly difficult that many people just want to end their lives, of course, because it's so difficult. But the beauty of it is that because we have the capacity to experience that kind of pain, that also means that we have the capacity to not experience that kind of pain, to go through it, to heal, to integrate grief and suffering into who we are as a person, to grow and to evolve. So the fact that we experience pain means we can evolve because it's part of who we are as people. From that kind of foundational idea, therapists, in my view, and as the pursuit of an artful therapy, have to be willing to sit in the pain with the client or clients, if it's a family, for instance, and to not cringe from that pain, to not judge the pain, to not go away from the pain, which means we have to be comfortable within ourselves as a human being with that level of pain. I've sat with hundreds and hundreds of families, somewhere around 8,000 families now in my career, thousands more individual clients, and been with them when they've told stories of abuse, of sexual abuse, of domestic violence, of the despair of losing a child, through divorces, through breakups, and family members leaving, never wanting to talk to those people again. That kind of pain and suffering. And it took some time for me to realize that simply sitting with people and acknowledging, witnessing the pain that they are in was a huge step for people's healing. To not have to feel like they had to protect me from their pain. And that's a major piece of what it takes to be able to be present with our clients through the pain that they have, that they have to know that we're not going to turn away from their pain. We're going to be right there with them, right there present with them, which means we have to figure out ways to be comfortable with that kind of suffering. And that's wonderful internal work to do as a person who's going to be a therapist, but as a person in any walk of life, as far as I'm concerned, that the ability to sit with the pain of life and not have it become so discouraging, so despairing that we end up as therapists or even as people feeling like life isn't worth it. To stay on top of that and instead to see it as part of the whole gamut of what life contains, that's a major part of the art of being a therapist.
I want to ask you about the issue of related to this of distancing. Some therapists put some effort into the concept and the experience themselves of distancing. One of them said to me, a person asked them, how do they deal with all this information being dumped on them?
Mm.
The therapist answered, the information is being dumped on me, it's being dumped in front of me.
Mm.
He was kind of creating a distance. But it sounds like you're describing something that's an alternative to that and it may be effective.
Mm. Yeah, that's an intriguing question. Many like graduate student interns who I've worked with and taught have asked a similar kind of question, like how do you deal with all that pain? What do you actually do with it? How do you conceptualize the role of being a therapist with that kind of pain? Um, so there's two parts of it for me. One part is that um, I'm a I'm a Star Trek fan. And in Star Trek, there were these things called force fields you could wrap around your ship. And sometimes the force fields would fail when they really got barraged heavily by photon torpedoes or such things. Um, so I've often thought, and this has been 30, 35 years running now, that there's a force field around me. And in some ways, it's similar to what you just said, Ananda, the dumping of emotional pain on the floor in front of us or something. But I thought about it a little bit differently for myself, that with the force field, the therapeutic stance force field that I'm experiencing, I can feel my client's pain and their suffering, but the force field filters out the part that would hurt me. So there's a high level of empathy and a high level of compassion, but a very, very low level of ownership. So I don't
Yes.
let it come through in the kind of way that it would hurt. Now, for sure, I get sad. For sure, I feel the suffering of it. And for sure, I relate to it in my own life, from the times that things have happened in my life that have been difficult and bad and hurtful, for sure. And for sure, it resonates within me, that kind of pain. But there's a filtering process there. And I just kind of imagine, literally imagine like a force field of light that filters that out. Um, so that's one aspect. Uh, the other aspect is acknowledging within my own self, as well as out loud to my clients, that there are very, very large cultural issues that operate in our world. Issues like poverty and racism and sexism and suicidality and drug and alcohol addiction and the oppression of minorities and disadvantaged people and marginalized people all across the world. These large, large global cultural problems. And those large cultural problems people talk about in all kinds of different ways and do papers on and books on and research and all kinds of approaches to looking at that stuff. But part of the reality is that those large cultural problems filter their way down into communities, into families, and into individual people's lives. And they impact people at the individual level, at the family level, at the community level. My role as a therapist that I take very, very seriously, and I think it's an ethical stance that was inspired by Michael White, one of the founders of narrative therapy, is that I'm intending to help that person free themselves up from these effects of these large cultural problems. That's a part of what I try to do. And when somebody talks about the pain that they're struggling with, the suffering that they're struggling with, for me, in the context that it's located in, is within those larger cultural problems. So it looks like an individual person's pain who's talking to me, and it is. And at the same time, it's a direct effect of the systems and the structures of our society. And they are struggling. They're like the front lines of the struggle with those large cultural problems. So I know that the pain that they're experiencing is both individual and it's being induced from these larger cultural problems. And I think of myself as engaging in a revolution with them, an act of freedom, a declaration of independence away from those effects of those larger problems.
And you've said in one place that you as a therapist try to be irreplaceable to your clients. What does
Hmm.
that word irreplaceable mean?
Hmm. Well, it's a particular role that we play in people's lives. We get invited in this incredibly privileged way, this really wonderful honor to come into their lives and to hear these profoundly personal stories. And I'm always honored by that. I always feel like it's such a great privilege to be asked to be of help with these difficulties that people are struggling with. And placing myself in relation to the issues that they're struggling with as someone who's going to walk with them on this journey, this hero's journey, this vision quest, makes me be a partner in that process. I'm not objective in what some people might consider as a professionally objective kind of way. I'm very, very committed to their vision of their life that they want to have and the unfoldment of that vision. And I can be a guide in helping them to figure out the next step and the next step and the next step. I can be at times a healing presence for them to help them go through the difficulties that are there in front of them in order to access these more generative, more healthy ways of being a person that they envision. At times, I could be a mentor. And all of those different stages, those different roles, and walking beside them in this hero's journey, all of them are steeped in this great respect that I have personally for anybody who comes to therapy, who seeks help and wants to make their life a better life, to move beyond the problems that brought them into therapy in the first place, and to leave those problems behind. So that that confluence of those different roles, the way that the process of therapy becomes an empowering process for them, makes me irreplaceable because I'm engaging so closely with that vision that they have, that I become a partner in that vision. And sometimes, and I've asked literally thousands of clients this, that when they're so discouraged and despairing um, because of the problems that are going on in their lives, that they can't see the vision, they can't see the hope, even though they were able to say it at one point. But in this particular point in the process, they can't feel it. I ask them if it's okay if I hold on to the hope, hold on to the vision that they have for their life until they're ready to reach out and grab it again. Um, and everyone has said yes to that. And so then it's my responsibility literally to walk with them, like holding this lantern is kind of how I see it. I'm walking like arm in arm or next to my client through this journey, holding this lantern. And when they're ready, I give the lantern back to them. Um,
Yes, good description.
yeah. So that's how I kind of envision it and how it gets lived out. Yeah.
I want to ask a two-part question. Now, returning to the subject of how a therapist can integrate some of this into their own practice as a therapist. Um, the two parts, one of them is what one would do to prepare oneself to be in the space to operate as a therapist in this way. And the second part of the question is how does one deal with the circumstances, the complications of the way the therapy is practiced and funded in this country at this time? You and I have been having spiritual conversations virtually every month for the several decades now.
Mhm.
That's been one way. So I've been able to observe with you your own evolving spiritual unfoldment. Do you think that therapists, in order to do this kind of artful therapy, need to have some identifiable spiritual practice um, of their own choosing? Uh, Anything from working on that force field that you talked about in the Star Trek sense, or using other terms that are more associated with traditional
Mhm.
spiritual language. Do you think a therapist needs to have a spiritual practice that's definable and that's actively pursued, with or without talking to someone like me?
Okay.
I'm retired.
Um,
Yet you and I, of course, are still talking, but I'm
right.
retired from. So what about the two parts? How does one do internally, and then how does one deal with the external?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's a really helpful um, practice to engage in supervision, we call it in the trade, um, and to find a supervisor who has a spirit that you resonate with as a therapist and as a person, and who challenges you and approaches the role of being a supervisor as a facilitator of your own evolution as a therapist and as a person. So I say it in that kind of way. I've been a supervisor for dozens and dozens of therapists over the years, hundreds. And I think that the process of engaging in supervision has many of the qualities of what we talked about at the beginning of being a spiritual path. I also think there's something intuitive or expansive in a spiritual sense that is really a powerful quality to bring in as a therapist into our work. Whether you talk with your clients openly about their spiritual lives, like directly, or whether you simply bring it in and you translate your own intuitions or uh, listen to their spiritual proclivities in ways that you can then ask about, like to ask about meaning, to ask about your heart of hearts, to ask about even to say, I know there are a lot of different pieces of what you're talking about here. For instance, you could say that to a client. There are a lot of different pieces of what we're talking about here, but I do wonder about what your view would be of the spiritual significance of what we're talking about to you as you understand your own spirituality. So that's a pretty direct way to ask that kind of question. So to be comfortable with the aspect of who we are as people that we call spiritual, so much so that you can be comfortable as a therapist to ask questions about it, to open up space for that quality to enter into um, the ongoing conversations. We used to kind of joke a bit when I was supervising grad students from behind the two-way mirror that there was always a shift that would happen. We'd all kind of giggle, but giggle out of delight, like it was delightful to see it happen when either the intern or a family member would start to talk about love in the discussion, in the conversations, in the therapy um, with their family. To bring the word love into a therapeutic process and to have that love be something that's uh, opened up and worked with and talked about, to me is a very powerful spiritual component. In the Bible, I believe Jesus was quoted as saying, God is love. That's a pretty profound thing to say. If we think about love, then therefore is God. Love is spiritual in its essence. So to open up that kind of space and to prepare yourself as you're becoming a therapist or are you working on the art of being a therapist, to consider that um, you're going to be delving into, and you probably have already delved into a lot of wonderful aspects of people's lives and painful aspects of people's lives. It could really be helpful to have your own process and to engage that process as part of what you do to prepare and to evolve as a therapist, process of spiritual life. And it could be as simple as having a mindfulness practice or a yoga practice, or I personally practice Tai Chi. And Tai Chi allows me to move energy in my own presence, another way that I deal with the pain that comes in therapy, to move the energy past me and to stay focused with the client, to let the expression of pain and sorrow and grief kind of flow past me, touching me, but flowing past me. It's a very Tai Chi way of thinking about how to deal with that kind of energy. That's a spiritual approach for me, this Tai Chi practice of conversation. So yeah, I think it's really important as a person that we both are comfortable in our therapeutic practice with all sorts of expressions of spirituality, and at the same time we're exploring our own so that we can be better and better at working with our clients in that way.
Yes, when I think about the external part of the question, certainly having a supervisor who is in this vein is going to help a person, help a therapist engage in artful therapy. Do you have any other ideas about how therapists can work in the context of an agency or dealing with lots of insurance requirements or other bureaucratic issues? Do
Yeah.
you have any thoughts about that you want to share with therapists about how to navigate any of that, in addition to having the right to therapists and having their own personal practice as
Yeah.
they choose?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question, Ananda. Um, yeah, I think these days I've talked with many supervisees who are out in the field the last 10 to 15 years. These days, I've seen more and more turning to what I think of as the assembly line approach to being a therapist. And assembly line meaning to work and work and work and work and work and work and like fill up your calendar, keep it moving, keep your paperwork coming in, to constantly be on the move, um, constantly pressured. And it's very much like a production line, the factory-based model of working. I think this is part of the trouble that we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation here, with the modern shape that the mental health industry has taken. And so many my supervisee clients have struggled with that and talk about the burnout and the pressure and the sense of not being able to keep up and how much that drains them and leads to burnout. So from the fundamental ideas that we've talked about here, one is to consider that because you're going to be uh, having to make some kind of an assessment and having to in your paperwork declare some kind of diagnosis in order for the insurance companies to reimburse or Medicaid to reimburse. So to consider that these concepts and ideas that we call mental illness are just that they are concepts, they're ideas, they're not reality. They're a way to think about what we do or how we operate as people. So to say to our clients, uh, tell me if this is true or not, but here are the different aspects of what you've talked about that you're struggling with, and kind of lay them out on the table between the two of you, or if it's with a family, between everybody. Yeah. And to say there are a couple different diagnoses that we could choose for these problems. Doesn't matter to me which one we choose. What do you think would be okay for you to have a name that we would call these problems? Now, this goes directly against the idea from the medical model that we're supposed to be able to diagnose people with these problems. That is a dehumanizing thing to do in my book, to say a person is one of these problems, to define their identity as one of these problems from that diagnostic statistical manual book. So instead, to engage the clients in what do we want to name these problems, not name them. They already have a name. We don't need to give them another name, but to name the problems because you're going to have to diagnose, you're going to have to submit a diagnosis. Do it in that collaborative kind of way and call the problems by that name. Don't call the person by that name. So that's one step. The second step is to consider that an assessment, if it's done on a person or on a family, is an act of violence. Because you're doing something to them within this context that we talked about earlier of power and systems of control. We're actually naming a human being and their problems by laying on this idea of assessment onto them. We're assessing them as a person. Thomas Szasz, in his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, said, if a person is talking with God, it's called praying. If God is talking to a person, it's called schizophrenia. And there's some truth in that. There's some fundamental problem in that, right? Of how we look at what is outside of the bell curve of what normal behavior is. So when we do an assessment, rather than thinking of doing an assessment onto a person, what we're going to do is we're going to sit down and we're going to take a look at the map, the context, the matrix of what is going on in their life, and get their agreement step by step of how we want to talk about this kind of issue, this kind of problem. What are the end visions, the end goals that they'd like to see for themselves, and how I, as a practitioner, how you as a practitioner can be helpful to them in moving toward those end goals. So as much as humanly possible in those settings, aligning ourselves with our clients as people, not as problems, and walking with them again, this idea of walking with them, being honored that they would turn to us for help, so much so that we refuse to label them with these diagnostic names. If we just start with that, and if you're in this kind of assembly line agency, if you just start with that idea, that you're putting your clients first, like literally their own opinions first, their own thoughts first, rather than this sort of pseudo expertise that we have in our mental health industry of knowing what the right diagnosis is for a particular person. Rather than doing that, what we do is we end up lifting that person up, lifting that family up, so that they're the people who are deciding and making decisions about how things are going to be languaged. And that's a key piece. Both of the work that we do, but also as practitioners, it's a key piece to locate ourselves within the context of their empowerment, rather than thinking we have to be the experts in their lives. I don't ever want to be an expert in someone else's life. They're the experts in their lives. They're the ones who have to live with themselves every single day and all the people around them. What I want to do is bring my expertise to play in helping them to walk this healing path. And then the last thing I would say, Ananda, to your question is to find support for that kind of engagement. And there are lots of supportive communities within the mental health industry who refuse to, for instance, to diagnose people. They'll talk about problems instead. The whole family therapy branch of our work didn't have diagnoses at all. People didn't even talk like that. And to this day, many people still don't who are family therapists. They don't include that whole idea. So we just have to realize that when we are in line with those systems of control, they're controlling us, and that's going to be a dehumanizing experience for us as well. We have to, in my opinion, we have to work to free ourselves from those structures of control, those systems of control.
Thank you, Don. It's been an honor to ask you these questions.
Thank you, Ananda. I really, really appreciate you doing it. Very much
You're
so.
welcome.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.
All right. Take good care. Bye now.